In the city of Viridia, built upon layers of its own forgotten sins, people whispered of the psalmist. It was not a ghost story, but a rumor of final accounting. Those who had committed true moral atrocities, not the criminals caught by law, but the architects of silent ruinations, would sometimes vanish. And in the place of their disappearance, a small, crude figurine of dried clay would be found, shaped like a weeping human form. Father Alden, a man whose faith had long curdled into a tool for control, was the latest to hear the whispers. He presided over the Cathedral of the Sacred Promise, a towering edifice of stained glass and gold leaf, funded by anonymous donations from the city's most toxic industries. He preached charity while evicting widows from church-owned slums. He spoke of purity while systematically silencing the altar boys who dared speak of his special attentions. His sins were not of blood, but of poison, administered drop by drop, hidden behind a benevolent smile and a raised hand of benediction. One evening, after dismissing a sobbing mother whose son had just taken his own life with a note mentioning the priest's name, Alden returned to his opulent private study. The room was warm, lined with books he never read, a fireplace casting dancing shadows. He poured a glass of rich, imported brandy, his hands steady. The whispers were for the guilty, and he had long since rationalized his own soul into a state of spotless, administrative grace. Then, the air changed. The comforting smell of old paper and beeswax was replaced by the scent of wet earth, raw clay, and a faint coppery temps. The dancing firelight seemed to slow, then still, as if the very air had thickened. From the deepest shadow in the corner, where no shadow should have been able to hold such mass, it emerged. It was the psalmist. To call it a creature was to misunderstand its nature. It was a process given form. Its body seemed sculpted from the very mud of a riverbank, slick and dark, eternally weeping thin rivulets of silty water that pooled at its feet. Its face was smooth, featureless save for two deep, hollow pits for eyes that held the absolute black of a starless midnight. In its hand it did not carry a weapon, but a lump of pale, wet clay. It stood not with menace, but with the terrible, patient stillness of a landslide waiting to happen. Father Alden dropped his glass. Crystal shattered on the Persian rug, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. His heart, a muscle he'd long considered merely rhetorical, hammered against his ribs. "By the grace of God, be gone," he choked, raising a trembling hand to make the sign of the cross. The psalmist tilted its head. From the hollows of its eyes, a soft, grinding sound emanated, like stones turning in a grave. It was not a voice, but the sound of judgment being weighed. It took a step forward, and the floorboards did not creak. It groaned as under a great weight. Alden's courage, a facade as thin as guilt, evaporated. He stumbled back against his desk. "I am a servant of the light. You have no power here." The psalmist raised its hand of clay. The lump began to move, to remember. It reshaped itself, forming a tiny, perfect replica of the cathedral's slum tenements. Then, from the clay, a minuscule figure of a weeping woman formed, evicted by a speck of clay in a priest's robe. The scene melted and reformed into the figure of a boy, his clay face a mask of silent terror, shrinking from the advancing speck priest. It was a playback. A sculpted, silent testimony of every life he had warped, every trust he had betrayed. Each tiny tragedy was formed from the clay with agonizing slowness, held before his eyes, then absorbed back into the whole. This was its judgment, not a list of charges, but an enforced, undeniable empathy. He was being made to see, not with his eyes, but with his soul. "No," Alden whimpered, tears of sheer panic springing to his eyes. They were weak. They were temptations. I was their shepherd. The psalmist took another step. The tiny scenes in the clay grew darker. The boy's clay form was shown writing a note, then lying still. The mother's figure knelt, her tiny head in her hands. The clay wept real water. Then, the psalmist reached out its free hand towards Alden. He tried to scream, but his breath froze in his lungs. The touch was not cold, but null, a perfect absence of warmth, of spirit. Where its muddy fingers brushed his forehead, a sensation bloomed that was worse than any pain. He felt it. He felt the dizzying vertigo of the widow standing on the street with her meager belongings. Not as a thought, but as a raw, physical reality in his own nervous system. He felt the crushing, suffocating despair of the boy in the vestry, the taste of shame like bile in his own mouth. He was being flooded with the emotional consequences of his actions, a tsunami of borrowed suffering that threatened to shatter his mind. They were no longer his victims, they were him. Their tears became his tears, their silent screams his own stifled voice. He collapsed to his knees, great heaving sobs racking his body. They were not tears of repentance, but of a soul drowning in the reflected agony it had caused. Make it stop. Please, make it stop. The psalmist stood over him, a patient, weeping monolith. The judgment was complete. The sentence was understanding. Now came the punishment. The hand holding the clay reached for Alden's chest. He did not resist. He was broken by comprehension. The clay touched his sternum, and it did not push, it pulled. It was as if the psalmist was drawing out the very essence of his being, the corrupted record of his life. Alden felt himself being drawn into the clay. His consciousness didn't fade. It compressed. The world, the study, the fire, his own body, stretched, warped, and receded as if he were falling backwards down a tunnel. The sensation was one of unbearable, infinite density. He was being folded, pressed, sculpted. His last human sensation was the sound of his own weeping, now thin and high, like the whistle of wind through a tiny fissure. Then silence. In the study, the psalmist was gone. The fire crackled normally. On the floor, where Father Alden had knelt, sat a small figurine of dried clay. It was a crude but unmistakable likeness of the priest, captured in a moment of abject, sculpted sorrow, his hands covering a face twisted in a silent scream, 2 deep grooves traced from its eyes down its cheeks, stained dark by the silt of its making. The next morning, a sacristan found it. He knew the whispers. He lifted the clay figure with reverent horror. It was cool to the touch, and faintly damp, as if perpetually weeping from within. A single human tear fell from the sacristan's own eye onto the tiny clay head. He had known the widow, had suspected about the boy. He placed the figurine on the priest's empty desk, a perfect, terrible paperweight. The punishment was not death, it was curation. Father Alden was now a museum piece of his own sin, a psalm of sorrow written in clay. Forced to feel the weight of every tear he had caused for all eternity, a tiny, silent monument to the fact that some judgments are not delivered from on high, but rise, patient and implacable, from the very ground we corrupt.